You stand among the crowd, your breath caught in the frost of a January morning. The wooden scaffold looms ahead, its beams slick with ice, its planks freshly planed yet already darkened by old stains. A black-clad figure waits, silent, still. Beside him, the block, a broad-bladed axe rests on the straw. You can smell the cold metal from here, sharp as blood. The man who will kneel today is no common criminal. It is Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, dressed not in royal robes, but in 2 plain shirts, so the winter chill will not make him shiver, lest it be mistaken for fear. The murmurs fade, the silence thickens, and when steel finally falls, it will be into that silence. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you're about to remember may never leave you again. If you find value in remembering history exactly as it happened, without embellishment, without mercy, then stay. Listen, let the cold morning of January 30th, 1649, settle into your bones, and when the last word is spoken, if you believe more stories like this should be preserved and told, then subscribe, leave a mark, just as history has marked us. The past does not beg for your attention, but once you've heard it, it will not let you go. It is winter in London, 1649. The English Civil War has ended, but the air is not at peace. For years, the realm has been torn apart, parliamentarian against royalist, Puritan against Anglican, neighbor against neighbor. Cities are scarred by siege, villages emptied by war. The king's armies have been defeated, but his shadow still hangs over the land. You are in Whitehall, in the heart of power. The Banqueting House, once built for royal splendor, now holds a prisoner instead of a court. That prisoner is Charles I, the man who once claimed divine right to rule, now tried and condemned by his own subjects. No English king has ever faced a public execution. The thought alone unsettles even those who called for his death. Outside, soldiers line the streets, their breath steaming in the cold. They are not only here to guard the scaffold, they are here to contain the people. The trial, held at Westminster Hall earlier that month, had been swift. The charge, treason against England, for waging war against his own people. Charles had refused to plead, insisting no court had authority over a king. His silence did not save him. The sentence was death. You are no noble, no courtier. You are one of the many summoned, ordered, or drawn by curiosity to witness what has never been seen before. The parliamentarians want the king's death to be public, a statement that no man, not even a monarch, stands above the law, but they also fear unrest, the spark of rebellion. Some in the crowd have lost fathers and sons to the king's wars. Others still see him as God's chosen ruler. It is not only politics that makes this day heavy. There is a deep, ancient taboo in executing an anointed sovereign. In the minds of many, his death will not just be a political act, it will be a sacrilege. And sacrilege, in a century steeped in religious belief, carries with it the shadow of divine retribution. The scaffold itself has been prepared with unusual care. It has been built outside the Banqueting House, facing Whitehall, but set back enough to allow soldiers to stand between the king and the mass of onlookers. The executioner will wear a mask, not for spectacle, but for protection. No man wants to be known as the one who struck the king's head from his shoulders. In the past, such men have been cursed, attacked, even assassinated. Inside the Banqueting House, Charles has spent the morning in prayer. According to contemporary accounts, he has slept little, rising before dawn to meet with Bishop Juxon, his confessor. He dresses deliberately, 2 shirts, as noted later by witnesses, so the cold will not make him tremble. Every action is intended to display dignity, to control how history will see him. The sound outside is muffled through the thick walls, boots on snow, the creak of timber, the low hum of thousands gathered. You stand near the front, close enough to see the frost on the scaffold rails. There is a smell in the air, a mixture of burning wood from street braziers, the acrid tang of gunpowder from the soldiers' muskets, and the faint, metallic promise of blood. Soon, the king will walk from the building to the platform. And when he does, the world will change. The monarchy will never be the same. The people will see, with their own eyes, a sight they were told they would never see, the body of a living king. And then, moments later, a lifeless one. The silence before it begins is already heavy, and you will carry it with you for the rest of your life. The light is thin, the kind that creeps reluctantly into a winter's dawn. You are already in Whitehall. The frost beneath your boots brittle, the air sharp enough to bite the inside of your nose. Somewhere behind the walls of the Banqueting House, a king is preparing to die. Inside, Charles Stuart has been awake for hours. According to Bishop William Juxon, who will attend him until the end, the king rose well before the sun. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow, broken by the tolling of the night watch and the echo of his own thoughts. You imagine him moving slowly in the dim light of candles. The air inside just as cold as outside. No fires have been kept blazing in his chamber. There is no warmth to offer. His clothing is laid out with deliberate care. 2 plain linen shirts, both clean, both white. It is not vanity. Witnesses later record his own explanation. He will not shiver from the cold and have it mistaken for fear. Over them, a dark cloak, heavy wool, breeches, plain stockings, leather shoes polished to a dull shine. On his head, a simple cap. Gone are the jeweled crowns, the embroidered doublets, the lace ruffs. This is not the attire of a monarch presiding over court. It is the dress of a man meeting the block. Bishop Juxon reads from the Book of Common Prayer. The familiar words, once part of ceremony and ritual, now serve as the final anchor between Charles and the world he knows. You are told he listens without interruption, his hands folded, his face calm. Whether that calm is genuine or practiced, no one records. History, in this moment, refuses to speculate. In the corridors beyond, soldiers move in pairs, their boots striking the wooden floors with a rhythm that cuts through the prayer. The parliamentarian guard is not large, but it is disciplined. Men have been handpicked for their loyalty to the cause, and for their willingness to keep their faces impassive in the presence of a dying king. Muskets are kept primed, powder dry, not against the king himself, but against the crowd that waits outside. You stand among that crowd now, though the cold makes you shift your weight from foot to foot. The scaffold has been built higher than most, the better for all to see. It is surrounded by ranks of soldiers, their halberds upright, points glinting with frost. The wood is fresh cut, the smell of resin still clinging to the beams. Straw has been scattered across the platform, both to soak the blood and to give the executioner surer footing. Above it all, a black draped rail runs the length of the stage, a small concession to decorum, or perhaps to contain the public's view of the corpse. From within the banqueting house comes the sound of movement, faint but distinct. A door opens, and the murmurs in the crowd falter. It is not the king yet, only a small party of officers and attendants. They move quickly across the yard, checking the scaffold, speaking in low tones to the masked executioner. He is already dressed for his work. A coarse cloth hood covers his head entirely, with only 2 small eye holes cut out. His identity will remain hidden from the public, for protection and perhaps for shame. The axe he will use is broad and gleaming. It has been sharpened to a razor's edge, its surface polished so clean you could see your own reflection, if you dared to look. On the platform, a block of oak sits solid and unyielding. The wood bears old marks, scars from past executions. Even here, in the killing place of a king, history has left its fingerprints. Back inside, Charles takes his final meal, bread and a cup of claret. He eats little, speaks little. Accounts note that he maintains a composed demeanor. though the temperature inside is low enough for breath to cloud the air. When Juxon finishes his prayers, the king speaks to him quietly. The words are recorded, "I have a good cause, and a gracious God on my side." They are meant to reassure, but they are also the public message he will repeat before the axe falls. When the time comes, a knock sounds on the door 3 times. Deliberate, Colonel Hacker, one of the officers in charge, announces that the scaffold is ready. The king rises. His attendants move to help him with his cloak, but he waves them away and adjusts it himself. This simple act, a man fastening his own garment, seems to carry more weight than the fine robes he once wore at coronation. You watch as a line of soldiers forms a narrow corridor from the banqueting house to the scaffold steps. The crowd presses forward, the cold momentarily forgotten. Many are silent. Some mutter prayers, others curse under their breath. There are parliamentarians here who came to see justice done, and royalists who came to see a martyr crowned in death. All of them, willingly or not, will witness what follows. The door of the banqueting house opens. Charles emerges. For a moment, the cold light catches his face, pale but steady, eyes scanning the crowd without flinching. He walks slowly, each step measured. The wooden boards of the temporary walkway creak underfoot. The soldiers flanking him move in perfect unison, their muskets angled outward to keep the crowd at bay. From your place near the front, you can see the breath of the executioner plume from behind his hood. You can see the block waiting, the axe resting beside it on the straw. The king mounts the scaffold without hesitation. The boards groan faintly under his weight. He stands in the center, framed by the black rail, and turns to address the crowd. The murmurs fade into stillness. Even the soldiers seem to hold their breath. Charles begins to speak, his voice steady despite the cold. He insists he has always sought the liberty and freedom of his people, that he dies, a faithful man of the Church of England. His words are formal, almost ceremonial, but here, on this platform, they are also his last defense, not against the axe, but against history's judgment. When he finishes, he hands his cloak and the insignia of the Order of the Garter to Bishop Juxon. "Remember," he says, "it is for peace that I die." Then he kneels. The block is low. He stretches forward to test it. Adjusting his position, he whispers to the executioner. He will give the signal when ready. The masked man nods once. Silent, his hands rest on the haft of the axe, fingers tightening. You feel the weight of the moment pressing into the air. Every breath seems too loud, every heartbeat too fast. The king positions himself again, steadying on his elbows. His hair has been tucked into a cap to keep it clear of the blade. "I am the King of England," he says quietly, almost to himself. Then, louder, "I am ready." You can see the condensation of the king's breath against the winter air as he leans forward over the block. The scaffold is unnervingly quiet. The crowd below has gone still. Even the shuffling of feet and the clink of armor from the soldiers seems to have stopped. There is only the faint rasp of the executioner's boots shifting position, the creak of timber beneath the weight of history about to be made. Charles stretches his arms forward, placing his hands carefully on either side of the block. His fingers curl against the rough oak. Witnesses will later note that his voice is calm as he speaks the agreed-upon signal, "Stay for the sign." Then, in a final, almost gentle motion, he lays his neck against the cold wood. The masked executioner steps forward, the polished edge of the axe catching what little light the overcast sky offers. The weapon is heavy, designed for a single, decisive blow. Every muscle in the man's arms tightens. You can hear the faint crackle of frost under his boots as he shifts to plant himself firmly. The crowd is holding its breath with him. The king's final words, if they can be called that, are not shouted but spoken in a voice meant for the ears of God. "I am the King of England. I die a faithful man." He stretches his arms once more, steadying himself. and utters the quiet command, "Strike." The axe falls. It is not the ringing sound of metal on stone you might imagine. The blade drives into flesh and bone with a dull, heavy impact. One clean stroke, contemporary accounts agree on this point, severs the head from the body. There is a gasp from the crowd, but no immediate cry. The head, still wearing the plain white cap, is lifted high by the executioner for all to see. The silence is total. The gesture is ceremonial, almost liturgical in its deliberate pace. The executioner turns, showing the severed head to each side of the scaffold. The blood, hot and bright against the gray day, steams faintly in the cold. It runs quickly into the straw, darkening it. The king's body slumps forward, the neck's raw edge pressed to the block. The smell of fresh blood, coppery, unmistakable, reaches you even through the freezing air. For a heartbeat, nothing happens. The crowd stands in stunned stillness, as though unsure what reaction history demands. Then, from somewhere deep within the mass of onlookers, a single groan begins, a sound of grief or horror. Difficult to tell, it ripples outward, mingling with murmured prayers, curses, and sharp intakes of breath. There is no triumphant cheer, no eruption of voices. The silence, broken only by these scattered sounds, is far more unsettling. The executioner lowers the head and places it in a basket near the block. A black cloth is thrown over it. Soldiers on the scaffold step forward, moving with practiced efficiency to wrap the king's body in a sheet. The whole process is brisk but not rushed, the kind of solemn efficiency that comes from rehearsing a grim duty. Those who stand close enough, gentlemen of the court, officers, and certain parliamentarian officials, will later recall the king's face as it was in that moment, pale, eyes closed, the mouth slightly open, no visible sign of pain. The skin, drained of color, had already begun to cool in the winter air. Bishop Juxon, still present on the scaffold, is seen bowing his head in silent prayer. His lips move, but no one can hear the words over the soft rustle of soldiers shifting their stance and the faint creak of the scaffold's boards. From the edge of the platform, a young officer calls out for the crowd to remain calm. The soldiers tighten their line, halberds angled outward. The fear of disorder is real. Parliamentarian leaders know that the execution of an anointed king could trigger riots, even rebellion. But no such outburst comes. The shock is too deep, the enormity of what has happened too heavy for the cold air to carry away. It is noted by diarists and chroniclers that several in the crowd press forward after the body is removed, eager to dip handkerchiefs in the blood as relics. This act, though quickly discouraged by the soldiers, happens nonetheless. The belief is that the blood of a king has healing powers, a remnant of the old idea of the monarch as God's anointed. A few succeed before being driven back. The executioner, still masked, remains on the scaffold for a moment longer. His posture is rigid, his head slightly bowed. Whether this is respect, exhaustion, or merely the careful maintenance of anonymity, no one knows. He does not speak. When he finally descends, it is quickly, disappearing into the ranks of soldiers. The king's body, now headless and wrapped in cloth, is carried back into the banqueting house. The crowd, sensing that the moment is over, begins to disperse, yet the silence lingers, carried in the shallow crunch of boots on frost, in the slow and reluctant movement of people turning away. Conversations are hushed, glances are averted. You remain in place for a few moments longer, watching the last traces of steam rise from the darkened straw. The air feels heavier than it did before. The blood on the platform will be cleaned, but the stain, both literal and symbolic, will remain in memory. In the days to come, Parliament will order that Charles be buried quietly, without the grandeur of a royal funeral. His remains will be taken to Windsor Castle and interred in St. George's Chapel beside Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. But that is still ahead. For now, in this cold morning, The image is fixed, the axe descending, the head lifted, the world changed. The scaffold stands empty. Soldiers remain at their posts. But their eyes no longer scan the crowd. They are fixed instead on the wooden structure. As though expecting it to speak, a few officers exchange low words. Bishop Juxon descends slowly, clutching the garter insignia the king had given him moments before his death. In later years, writers will describe this scene in language ranging from reverent to horrified. Royalist accounts will speak of martyrdom, the sacrifice of a king who refused to betray his conscience. Parliamentarian accounts will speak of justice, the leveling of all men before the law. But no matter the lens, all agree on the fact that it happened in silence, broken only by the sound of the axe and the collective breath of thousands who will never forget the sight. You, standing there, can feel the cold settling deeper into your bones now. The moment has passed, yet its shadow stretches forward. The monarchy will return in time, but it will never again be the same. The idea that a king's body is untouchable has been severed as cleanly as the neck on that block. And as you turn away, the image refuses to fade. A winter morning in Whitehall, the scaffold high against the pale sky, and a head once crowned now lying under black cloth in a wicker basket. It will follow you, long after the frost melts, long after the streets of London fill again with the noise of markets and carriages. Long after this crowd dissolves into history, you will still see it when you close your eyes. The day the axe fell in silence. The crowd's murmurs fade behind you as soldiers close ranks around the scaffold. The cold air clings to your face, the tang of blood still in your nostrils. On the platform, the wicker basket with its black cloth covering the king's head is lifted by two men and carried away. The body, wrapped tightly in plain linen, follows, borne by guards whose faces remain fixed forward. The descent from the scaffold is slow, not from hesitation, but from care. The boards creak under their boots as if groaning under the weight of what they bear. The doors of the banqueting house swing open, swallowing the procession. You move with the shifting crowd to keep them in sight, your eyes adjusting from the pale winter light to the dimness inside. The air is still colder here, the stone floor holding the night's chill. A faint scent of wax and tallow hangs in the space, mingling now with the metallic sharpness of blood. Inside, the atmosphere is different, quieter, more controlled. Parliamentarian officials stand at the edges of the room, their expressions unreadable. Bishop Juxon enters just behind the body, his hands clasped tightly, still holding the insignia the king had entrusted to him. The executioner does not follow. His role ended the moment the axe was laid down. He has disappeared into the anonymity his hood provided. The body is laid on a long table. Attendants move quickly, unwinding the linen to expose the torso. Even in death, Charles looks composed. The cut at the neck is clean, the edges slightly retracted under the cold air. There is no excess bleeding now. Gravity has done its work. The cap is removed from the severed head, and for a moment, you see his features clearly. The eyes are closed, the skin pale with a faint bluish cast at the lips. There is no distortion, no grimace, only the slack stillness of death. Those present will later testify that Bishop Juxon stepped forward at this moment, placing his hand gently on the forehead of the severed head and bowing in silent prayer. He says nothing to the officials, and they say nothing to him. The body is washed. This is not ceremony, it is necessity. Cold water, brought in copper basins, is poured over the skin. The attendants use coarse cloths to wipe away the blood from the torso, arms, and hands. The head is treated separately, its hair and beard carefully combed to remove clotted strands. It is not embalmed. There will be no lying in state, no public viewing. Parliament has ordered that the burial be private, to avoid turning the dead king into a martyr. Outside, Whitehall is slowly emptying. Soldiers remain posted, but the crowd has begun to scatter down the narrow, Frost-covered streets. Some leave in silence, others in whispered arguments about what the execution means. A few are openly angry, cursing Parliament, predicting divine punishment. But there is no uprising, not today. Inside, attendants bring a plain wooden coffin into the room. It is unadorned, lined with simple cloth. The body is dressed in a clean white shroud before being placed inside. The head is positioned carefully with the torso, the linen pulled up to cover the join at the neck. Those in attendance step back as the lid is lowered, the dull thud of wood meeting wood echoing faintly in the vaulted chamber. The coffin will not remain here long. Arrangements have been made for it to be taken to Windsor Castle. But not immediately. The night will pass with the coffin under guard in St. James's Palace. This is not tradition, it is a security measure. Rumors already swirl of royalists planning to reclaim the king's body for a grand funeral. Parliament will allow no such gesture. In the streets, pamphlets are already being printed. Some hail the execution as justice, proof that even a king is subject to the law of the people. Others denounce it as murder, the ultimate act of rebellion against God's appointed ruler. The press is swift, and within days, the event will be debated in coffeehouses and pulpits across England. You remain in Whitehall long enough to see the coffin carried out under heavy guard. The air is sinking toward evening now, the light paling, the frost thickening again. The soldiers march in formation, their boots striking the cobblestones with an even rhythm. The streets are lined with those who did not attend the execution but have come to see the king's final departure from London. There are no cries, no flowers thrown into the path, only the low, persistent murmur of hundreds of people pressing close enough to watch but not close enough to interfere. At St. James's Palace, the coffin is placed in a guarded chamber. Bishop Juxon remains with it for a time, sitting in silence, the small insignia still in his hands. There is no vigil beyond this, no choir singing through the night, no procession of mourners. The orders from Parliament are explicit. The burial will be modest, and only a handful of people will attend. The next morning, the journey to Windsor begins. The road is hard under the frost, the air cutting against the face like glass. The procession is small, no banners, no heralds, no symbols of monarchy. A few loyal attendants ride behind the cart that bears the coffin, their breath misting in the air. The route avoids large towns where crowds might gather. By the time they reach Windsor, the sky is low and heavy with clouds. Inside the castle, St. George's Chapel has been prepared in the simplest manner. The vault where the king will rest already holds the remains of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. This burial, like theirs, will be marked by stone and inscription, but not by the rights and grandeur once reserved for sovereigns. The coffin is lowered into the vault with little ceremony. Bishop Juxon, still steadfast, reads a brief service from the Book of Common Prayer, defying Parliament's order that the new, Puritan form of worship be used. It is a quiet act of loyalty, witnessed only by a few. Once the stone is replaced and the final words spoken, the small group disperses. No public announcement is made. In London, the scaffold is already being dismantled, its timber taken away piece by piece. The place where a king's head fell is returned to the anonymity of bare ground. In the weeks that follow, England adjusts, uneasily, to life without a king. The monarchy is abolished, replaced by the Commonwealth under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. Royalist plots simmer beneath the surface. But for now, Parliament holds control. The memory of January 30th remains fresh, however, preserved in the minds of those who stood in the cold and saw the blade fall. You, too, will remember it, not only the moment of execution, but the quiet after, the sound of boots carrying a coffin through frost, the pale winter light on the stone of Windsor, the stillness of a grave sealed in silence. The body without a crown is at rest, but the wound it leaves, on the monarchy, on the nation, on the idea of divine right, remains open, and in that wound, history will plant the seeds of what comes next. The news spreads faster than the frost can melt. Even before the scaffold in Whitehall is dismantled, messengers are on the roads, carrying word of the king's death to towns and villages across England. They ride hard, through the brittle winter air, their hooves striking frozen mud. In the capital, the printers work without pause. Broadsheets and pamphlets are already rolling off the presses before the blood on the scaffold has fully dried. You are in a London street when you first hear the reading of the official declaration. Charles Stuart, having been found guilty of high treason, was executed by the authority of the High Court of Justice on the 30th day of January, 1649. The voice that reads it is steady, but the air around the words is taut. Men in plain parliamentarian dress nail copies of the proclamation to doors and market boards. Their eyes are sharp, scanning the crowd for any sign of dissent. The reactions are divided, as the leaders in Westminster expected and feared. In some corners of the city, there is grim approval. Those who had suffered under the king's taxes, or seen their towns burned in his wars, speak of justice done. They nod to one another, satisfied that the law has at last been made equal to all men. In the taverns favored by parliamentarian soldiers, toasts are made, not loudly, but with a certain satisfaction that they have lived to see the act completed. Elsewhere, the mood is darker. Royalist sympathizers speak in hushed voices, looking over their shoulders. For them, the execution is not justice, it is sacrilege. The monarch, anointed by God at his coronation, has been cut down like a common criminal. Old superstitions resurface. Some whisper that the land will be cursed, that the weather will turn against the harvest, that plagues will follow. In a century still steeped in religious conviction, such fears carry weight. In the weeks that follow, Parliament works quickly to reshape the kingdom. On February 7th, an act is passed formally abolishing the monarchy. The House of Lords, too, is dissolved. England is now declared a Commonwealth, a republic. Oliver Cromwell, though not yet Lord Protector, rises rapidly in influence. His speeches are resolute. The execution was necessary to secure liberty, to prevent the tyranny of kings from returning. You hear his name in the streets, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with venom. For Royalists, Cromwell is the regicide in chief, the man whose will and military strength made the execution possible. For his supporters, he is the defender of the nation against tyranny. In the press, pamphlets defending the act are printed in large numbers. One, titled Iconoclastes and authored by John Milton, is a direct attack on the royalist portrayal of Charles as a martyr. Milton's pen, as sharp as any blade, becomes another weapon in this political war. But not all of England is under Parliament's firm control. In Scotland, the reaction is immediate and hostile. The Scots had delivered Charles to Parliament in 1647, but they had not intended his death. To them, the execution is both a political affront and a violation of the covenant they believed bound king and people together. Within weeks, the Scottish Parliament declares Charles II, son of the executed king, as the rightful ruler of Scotland. The seeds of the next war are already sown. Across the sea in Ireland, the response is equally charged. Ireland had been a battleground throughout the civil wars, and news of the execution intensifies divisions. Royalist forces there rally to Charles II's cause, while parliamentarian armies prepare to bring Ireland firmly under the Commonwealth's control. Within months, Cromwell himself will land on Irish soil, and the conflict will escalate into some of the bloodiest campaigns of the century. Beyond the British Isles, the execution shocks Europe. In the courts of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, the death of a king at the hands of his subjects is almost unthinkable. Monarchs across the continent see it as a dangerous precedent, an invitation for their own people to question the divine right of kings. In France, young King Louis XIV is shielded from much of the discussion. but his advisors study the event with unease. In the Dutch Republic, which has its own complex relationship with republicanism, reactions are mixed. Some admire the act as a bold assertion of popular sovereignty, others see it as a dangerous instability. You read translations of foreign dispatches, letters from ambassadors describing the scene in Whitehall. The masked executioner, the silence of the crowd, they are written in tones of disbelief, as though trying to reconcile the image of England, once a stable monarchy, with the reality of its king lying headless in a coffin. In England, Parliament tries to control the narrative. Official accounts emphasize the legality of the trial and the necessity of the sentence. Royalist writers, however, move swiftly to counter this. The most powerful of these is Icon Basilicae, a book purported to be the king's own meditations. Written during his imprisonment, whether or not Charles authored it, the work portrays him as a Christ-like martyr, wronged by his people and forgiving his enemies. It spreads quickly, aided by the clandestine efforts of royalist sympathizers. Even in parliamentarian-controlled London, copies circulate quietly. You notice subtle changes in daily life. The old royal emblems are stripped from public buildings. Coins bearing the king's face are gradually withdrawn from circulation. In churches, prayers for the monarch are omitted, replaced by petitions for the peace and prosperity of the Commonwealth. The familiar rhythms of monarchy are absent, no courtly ceremonies, no royal proclamations. Instead, orders come from committees and councils. And yet, the memory of January 30th refuses to fade. In private, people replay the moment, each detail fixed in their minds. The king's calm walk to the scaffold, the gleam of the axe, the silent lifting of the head. For some, it is a vision of justice; for others, a wound that will never heal. Weeks pass, and the frost begins to lift. The Thames thaws, markets fill again, and life resumes its surface normality. But underneath, the kingdom remains unsettled. In the taverns, arguments flare between parliamentarians and royalists. In the countryside, preachers thunder from pulpits about God's judgment, either on the tyranny of kings or on the sin of regicide. Depending on their allegiance, you hear one such sermon in a small church outside London. The preacher's voice is low but intense. He warns that when the people rise against the ruler God has set over them, they invite chaos into the world. A man beside you mutters that when kings rise against their people, they invite the justice of the sword. Neither man speaks to the other again, but the tension in the air is clear. In the ports, sailors speak of ships leaving for the continent, carrying royalist exiles. Some go to France, where Queen Henrietta Maria, widow of Charles I, is already in mourning. Others travel to the Spanish Netherlands, seeking allies and funds for the young Charles II's cause. Across Europe, the exiled court begins to take shape, a wandering shadow of the monarchy that once ruled from Whitehall. By the end of February, it is clear that the execution has not ended the conflicts of the three kingdoms. It has only transformed them. The wars that follow will be fought not over whether the king should be limited, but whether there should be a king at all. And for you, the memory of that day, standing in the cold as the axe fell, becomes the dividing line between two worlds, the England that was, and the England that now is. In time, the scaffold will be gone, the banqueting house returned to its ceremonial functions, and the streets of Whitehall filled with the sound of carriages instead of soldiers' boots. But the image remains: a pale winter sky, a masked man with an axe, and the head of a king held high in silence. Months turn to years, and the sharpness of the cold January morning fades from daily conversation. But the memory of Charles Stuart's death refuses to loosen its grip on England. In the immediate aftermath, the Commonwealth consolidates its authority. Oliver Cromwell emerges as the central figure, his influence growing until he becomes Lord Protector in 1653. The monarchy is gone, the House of Lords abolished, and the trappings of kingship stripped from public life. You walk through London in the early years of the Commonwealth and see the absence everywhere. The royal arms, once carved above public buildings and tavern doors, have been chiseled away. Portraits of Charles are removed from guild halls. Coins bearing his profile are melted down and restruck with the new Commonwealth design, a simple shield of St. George's Cross and the Irish harp. No king's face looks back at you from your pocket now. Parliament's goal is clear. Erase the image of Charles I as a sovereign and replace it with the idea of a republic governed by the people, or, more precisely, by those who claim to speak for them. Yet even as they strip away the symbols of monarchy, a different kind of image begins to form in the minds of his supporters. Royalist exiles scatter across Europe, carrying with them the story of the king's final moments. In Paris, Queen Henrietta Maria receives them in exile, her court a shadow of its former self. But fiercely loyal, they speak of Charles as a martyr, his composure on the scaffold proof of his divine right. The book Icon Basilicae, circulating almost immediately after his death, becomes their central text, purporting to be the king's own meditations during imprisonment. It depicts him as a Christ-like figure, betrayed, condemned, and executed for upholding his conscience. Whether Charles wrote it or not, it becomes one of the most popular books of the century, reprinted dozens of times despite Parliament's attempts to suppress it. In England, possessing a copy is an act of quiet defiance. You see them hidden behind false panels in bookshelves, passed discreetly from hand to hand. The language is devotional, the tone one of patience and sacrifice. For those still loyal to the monarchy, it is a sacred text. The anniversary of the execution, January 30th, begins to take on a ritual significance. In 1649, Parliament marks the day with no official observance, seeking to avoid creating any focal point for royalist sentiment. But royalists, in their private gatherings, speak the king's name, read passages from Icon Basilicae, and remember the morning when the axe fell. In some households, prayers are said for the soul of the royal martyr. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth faces its own challenges. Without a king, governance becomes a shifting balance of committees, councils, and military authority. Wars continue, against royalists in Scotland, against uprisings in Ireland, against Dutch fleets at sea. Taxes remain high. The army is a constant presence, and the Puritan moral code is enforced with new vigor. Theaters are closed, public festivities curtailed, even Christmas celebrations officially suppressed. You sense a quiet discontent growing. Some who once supported Parliament against the king now resent the restrictions of Puritan rule. In alehouses and marketplaces, people speak longingly, not necessarily of Charles himself, but of the stability and ceremony that monarchy provided. The image of the king's execution becomes less a memory of justice served, and more a reminder of the turmoil that followed. In Europe, the cause of the exiled Charles II gains momentum. France, Spain, and the Netherlands, while cautious, see advantage in supporting a claimant who might destabilize the Commonwealth. Foreign envoys report on English discontent, noting that royalist sympathies are far from extinguished. By the mid-1650s, you notice subtle changes in public speech. Parliamentarian officials still refer to Charles I as a tyrant, but the words feel rote, defensive. In contrast, royalist ballads, circulating quietly, speak of King Charles the Good and the Black Day of his death. These songs, set to old melodies, are passed along orally, impossible to suppress completely. The scaffold at Whitehall is long gone, the timber used elsewhere, the ground indistinguishable from its surroundings. But people point to the spot when they pass, as if the earth itself remembers. Some claim the air there feels colder, even in summer. The turning point comes after Cromwell's death in 1658. His son, Richard, lacks his father's authority and skill. The fragile balance of the Commonwealth begins to crumble. factions within the army, parliament, and the public push in different directions. In this uncertainty, royalist agents work openly to prepare the way for the return of the monarchy. By now, the image of Charles I as a martyr has been carefully cultivated for nearly a decade. The anniversary of his execution is observed more widely among royalists, sometimes even in defiance of local authorities. Pamphlets printed abroad describe his death in devotional terms, likening it to a saint's martyrdom. The term, the royal martyr, appears in print more frequently, attaching itself to his name as if it had always been there. You hear rumors of clandestine toasts made to the king over the water, referring to Charles II. In some taverns, the health of the exiled king is drunk in silence, glasses raised briefly before being set down. The public mood shifts. What was once the act of killing a tyrant is now, for many, the killing of a rightful king. In 1660, the tide turns decisively. General George Monk marches his army to London, calling for the restoration of the monarchy. Parliament, exhausted and fractured, opens negotiations with Charles II. In May, he enters London to public celebration. The streets lined with cheering crowds. The Commonwealth is over. One of the new king's earliest acts is to address his father's legacy. January 30th is declared a day of fasting and reflection, enshrined in the Anglican calendar as the day of the martyrdom of King Charles I. The service for that day, printed in the Book of Common Prayer, includes prayers that explicitly liken the late king's death to Christ's sacrifice. Statues of Charles I are erected, paintings of his execution commissioned, not to depict his defeat, but his dignity. You attend one such commemoration years later, standing in St. Paul's Cathedral as the preacher speaks of the king's final words. His composure before the axe, the executioner's mask, the winter cold, the silence of the crowd, all are invoked as signs of divine grace. The moment you once witnessed with your own eyes is now retold in tones of reverence. Every detail shaped to fit the legend. Over time, the political complexities of the Civil War fade from the public memory. For many, Charles I is no longer the ruler who levied unpopular taxes or clashed with Parliament over power. He is the man on the scaffold, the king in two shirts so the cold would not be mistaken for fear. The voice that said, "Strike," without trembling. In this way, death gave him what life could not: unity in the image of a steadfast monarch. But you remember more than the legend. You remember the frost underfoot, the steam rising from fresh blood, the quiet weight in the air before the axe fell. The sermons and statues cannot erase the reality of that moment, the raw, irreversible fact that a king's head fell in silence, and with it, a chapter of England's history closed forever. And so the king in memory is both things at once: the martyred sovereign of royalist devotion, and the condemned man of that winter morning. Between them lies the truth, waiting for those who care to look past the legend. The years turn into decades, and the morning of January 30th, 1649, moves from memory into history. Those who stood in Whitehall to witness the fall of the Axe Age and pass away, their recollections becoming the stuff of letters, diaries, and the pages of printed histories. Yet the scene does not fade. It changes shape, passed down through generations, each retelling carrying its own purpose. You walk through Whitehall in the early 18th century. The Banqueting House still stands, its classical facade unaltered. Tourists, wealthy enough to travel for curiosity, ask their guides where the scaffold once stood. The answer is vague, a gesture toward the stretch of pavement where carriages now roll. The precise spot is gone. The stones have been replaced many times. Yet for those who come seeking it, the location is less important than the knowledge that here a king's life ended. In the decades after the Restoration, the monarchy works to fix the meaning of that moment. January 30th remains a solemn date in the Anglican calendar. Churches across England hold commemorative services. reading the prayers for the royal martyr. Sermons recall the king's calm demeanor, his willingness to die for the Church of England, his steadfast refusal to betray his principles. The image of Charles kneeling at the block becomes almost saint-like in its constancy. But as political tides shift, so too does the treatment of his memory. In the 18th century, amid the growth of parliamentary power and constitutional monarchy, some begin to question the uncritical veneration of Charles. Historians start to examine his reign more closely, noting the conflicts, the dissolution of Parliament, the taxes levied without consent. The execution is still acknowledged as extraordinary, even shocking, but the king himself is no longer painted purely in the gold leaf of martyrdom. You visit a bookseller in the late 1700s and see new histories of the Civil War. Printed in neat volumes, they balance the accounts, placing Charles's death within a broader struggle over governance and liberty. The image of the execution remains vivid, but now it sits beside portraits of Oliver Cromwell, John Pym, and other parliamentarian leaders. The scaffold has become part of a wider narrative about the rights of the governed and the limits of sovereign power. In the streets, however, the more romantic vision persists. Ballads and engravings still show the king in 2 white shirts, his hair tucked into a cap, the masked headsman ready at his side. Some images are entirely imagined, based on no eyewitness drawing, yet they fix themselves in the popular imagination. A few artists depict the execution with more drama than truth: stormy skies, kneeling courtiers, weeping crowds. You know the day was cold but clear. The crowd largely silent, yet these flourishes take root in the public mind. By the 19th century, the execution has become a touchstone for debates about authority and liberty. Romantic poets speak of Charles as a tragic figure. Reformers cite his fate as proof that rulers who ignore the will of the people do so at their peril. The site in Whitehall is occasionally marked during significant anniversaries, with temporary platforms erected for speeches. The Banqueting House, no longer the center of courtly life, becomes a kind of monument not only to the Stuart monarchy, but to the fragility of power itself. You notice that the memory of the execution takes different forms depending on who is telling it. In Anglican sermons, it is a sacred sacrifice. In Whig histories, it is a necessary blow for liberty. In royalist circles, especially among Jacobites in the 18th century, it is an open wound. Proof of England's betrayal of its rightful king. These layers accumulate over time, making the event both a unifying symbol and a divisive one. Physical relics, too, play their part in keeping the memory alive. The execution block, whether genuine or merely believed to be, appears in collections and exhibitions, displayed in museums or private halls. The axe, or one claimed to be the axe, is shown with reverence, its steel still bright. These objects become pilgrimage points for those drawn to the story, tangible links to a mourning that otherwise survives only in words. In the Victorian era, a renewed interest in the monarchy brings Charles I back into public affection. Painters such as Paul de la Roche and Charles West Cope produce large, dramatic canvases of his trial and death. These are displayed in public galleries, drawing crowds who gaze at the stoic king on the scaffold. Bathed in a cold, symbolic light, the imagery is softened, less blood, more pathos. The executioner's hooded face remains, but his role is muted, almost anonymous. The focus is entirely on the king's dignity. The 19th century also sees the rise of historical tourism. Visitors to London are shown the Banqueting House as part of their itinerary. Guides point to the windows through which Charles is said to have stepped onto the scaffold. The accuracy of the detail is debated. Some argue he walked directly from a specially cut doorway, but the window becomes fixed in popular tours. People stand in Whitehall and look up, imagining the king emerging into the pale morning light. Through the 20th century, the tone of commemoration changes again. January 30th remains marked in the Church of England calendar. But public observance fades. The monarchy, now constitutional and symbolic, no longer needs the narrative of divine martyrdom. Historians approach the event with a more clinical eye, dissecting the legal process, the political pressures, and the military context that made such an unprecedented act possible. You stand in Whitehall in the mid-20th century and find no plaque, no public monument marking the place of execution. The traffic is constant, the noise unbroken. Only those who know the history recognize the Banqueting House as more than a piece of 17th century architecture. Yet for those who do, the air still feels different here. It is not the cold of that January morning, it is the weight of knowing that on this ground, the very concept of monarchy was shattered, if only for a time. In the modern day, reenactments and documentaries bring the execution to new audiences. Television dramatizations, some faithful, others indulgent, replay the scene in high definition. Historians debate not only Charles's actions, but the legitimacy of the court that condemned him. The image of the scaffold, the block, the hooded executioner lifting the head, these endure, adapted for each new medium. And so the scaffold remains, not in timber and nails, but in the mind. It stands in every retelling, from the most solemn sermon to the most sensational illustration. It is a symbol that can be shaped into many meanings: the martyrdom of a saintly king, the justice of a free people, the tragedy of civil war, the warning that power, however absolute, is never beyond challenge. You, having stood there on that day, carry the reality beneath all the retellings. The real scaffold was plain and practical. The air was sharp and cold. The crowd was silent, and when the axe fell, it was not followed by trumpets or cheers, only the heavy sound of the blade and the collective breath of thousands. Centuries later, when people stand in Whitehall and ask where it happened, you could tell them, you could point to the ground, the building, the window, but the truth is that the place is not the scaffold. The place is in the story, and the story is in the minds of those who remember. And so the execution of Charles I survives, not as wood or stone, but as an indelible image, of a king in two shirts, of a masked man with an axe, of a crowd holding its breath under a pale winter sky. Whitehall is different now. The traffic rolls past the Banqueting House, its pale stone washed by rain and exhaust. The windows are clean, the interior a museum of art and architecture. The scaffold is long gone, the frost of that January morning replaced by the hum of the modern city. And yet, if you stop, if you stand still long enough, you can almost feel the echo. The place is not marked. No carved stone tells the passerby that here a king's head once fell. But the story is embedded in the ground, in the masonry, in the air itself. It is carried in the pages of history books, in the brushstrokes of oil paintings, in the voices of guides leading small groups along the street. They point upward to the window, whether or not it was the one, and speak of a moment when England saw its own monarch kneel before an executioner. You remember it differently from the paintings, the sermons, the lectures. You remember the sharp air that morning, the muted crunch of frost under boots, the faint smell of burning from the soldiers' braziers. You remember the silence, not reverent, not fearful, but suspended, as if the world itself had stopped to watch. And then the sound, the single heavy strike, final and absolute, no speech, no cheer, no drumroll, just the moment when a human body, royal or not, ceased to be alive. Time has stripped away the immediacy of that moment for everyone else. For centuries, the meaning of the execution has been reshaped, used as a rallying cry, a cautionary tale, a symbol of liberty, a relic of faith. Charles I has been a martyr, a tyrant, a tragic hero, a failed ruler. The scaffold has been painted as a holy altar and as a stage of justice. But the truth is simpler, harder, and quieter. A man died because the balance of power had shifted against him. It is tempting to search for something larger in that silence, to hear in it the voice of God, or the will of the people, or the machinery of justice. Perhaps all of those were present. Perhaps none were. What is certain is that no crown, no title, no claim to divine right could stop the axe once it was raised. In that moment, the body on the scaffold was only that, a body. You have walked this street in every season since. Summer crowds laughing under bright sun. Autumn leaves blowing past the banqueting house steps. Winter mornings when frost clings to the windows just as it did that day. And always, the space between the building and the street seems slightly wider than it should be, as if the absence of the scaffold is still marked by an absence in the air. The memory of Charles I's execution persists not because of the political consequences, though they were immense, but because of the image. The plain shirts, the masked man, the head held high in silence. These details fix themselves in the mind because they speak to something deeper than politics, the fragility of human life. The speed with which power can be reduced to nothing. The certainty that all titles are temporary. And so, standing here now, you understand why the place needs no plaque. The lesson is not in the stone, but in the story. The scaffold stood for less than a day. The image it left has endured for centuries. It is a reminder that time erases all things, crowns, governments, even the memory of names, yet leaves behind moments that resist forgetting. The frost melts, the wood rots, the crowd disperses, the blood fades into the earth, but the silence after the axe, that remains.